This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. I hope you had a lovely break. I spent a lovely few days sunning myself on the Italian-Turkish border, which I had no idea it was such a beautiful part of the world. Only slightly marred by this enormous wall that somehow appeared on a non-existent landmass. But thanks to everybody who did such a valiant job of standing in for me over the holiday period, and well done to Eleanor for looking after them all so well. But normal service has now been resumed, and we will wade immediate. No, we won't actually. We'll pause to give a shout out at Vinny's behest to the most impressive 17-year-old in the world, the new champion of darts, Luke Littler, which was a magnificent moment in sporting history. And a quick shout to Martin as well, who's been in touch to remind us that it's National Divorce Day, and we already have our first couple, Nigel and Elon, falling out of love. What a short romance that was. And it is to Elon Musk that our attention turns first this morning. But I'm not, in the first instance, quite sure how. So something a bit weird has happened to me in the context of what you might describe as Elon Musk's universe. And I don't think we're going to have this argument today, but I don't think that there is much mileage in the argument that you should just ignore him. I think that's a vexed argument at the very best of times when somebody is dealing in disinformation and propaganda, or at worst, at the very least, dealing in sort of provocation and unpleasantness. And the idea that you ignore them, that to me always seems to have a slight caveat attached to it. You ignore them until you can't. But in Elon Musk's case, I don't think that caveat applies. If you are essentially in lockstep with the next president of the free world, if you are widely perceived to be the de facto deputy president, if you own one of the biggest social media platforms in the world, albeit one that has become something of a sort of far-right fertilizer since he started unbanning various liars, grifters and racists. If you are the richest man in the world and therefore capable of exercising epic power in all territories almost, then you cannot be ignored. I think it's foolish and naive to pretend that you can. But you notice a little pause in my voice there, I think, just a little catch. Should we be talking about this? Another thing that happened to me, the thing that I was referring to when I said I'm going through quite a strange phase, is that I'm barely on Twitter anymore. And here's a really interesting thing that is going to land with some people listening to this with absolute statement of the bleeding obvious energy, and with other people, I don't think you'll believe me. If you weren't on Twitter much over the holiday period, then an awful lot of what is dominating the news agenda today will have almost entirely passed you by. It's a really weird thing. I mean, wherever you get your news from, you'll be aware that Elon Musk has waded into the grooming gang story that has been covered quite widely in this country since 2011. But of course, the myth that it hasn't has taken hold in all sorts of corners of the country. So Elon Musk has waded into that, but much more dangerously, he's launched libelous attacks on Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, and on Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, which I think come from essentially subscribing to the sort of accounts that were banned for disinformation and racism before he bought Twitter. I don't know, because as I say, I haven't been on there much, but catching up on it yesterday afternoon and this morning in preparation for coming back to work, catching up on it and wondering, as I always do, whether or not we overthink these things. As far as I can tell, Elon Musk is just another Twitter account, albeit the biggest and the most powerful and the owner and the future de facto deputy president of the USA. I think he's just another Twitter account that desperately wants to believe all of the posts about all foreigners being criminals. He seems to me to be, I don't know whether white supremacist or whether he's still got the vestiges of the South African apartheid that he grew up on the wrong or the right side of, I suppose, depending on your politics. But you can overthink these things. You can dig too deeply into these things. when perhaps the answer is quite simple. He just believes it all. I know that there are conversations about some of his personal habits, the fact that he apparently doesn't sleep much, the fact that he's up in the middle of the night tweeting about and into the only sort of English language country that will be up and about in the middle of the night in America. But I think he might just be somebody who believes the most ridiculous nonsense from the kind of accounts on Twitter that have now been able to buy prominence by paying him money and getting blue ticks that were once reserved for people that had sort of proven themselves in professional fields. I think he just believes the worst excesses of the sewer that he has created. I mean, it's a psychologically extraordinary situation. He just is another person well, there's always that tension, isn't there, between what you believe and what you want to believe. That idea. So when we first started talking about the grooming gangs on this program in 2011, and recognizing and acknowledging that there was a huge disproportionate representation of men of Pakistani background in that very specific and particular type of crime, I was 2 or 3 phone-ins into the topic before I realised what was bothering me about it. And there was a desperation among some callers to use the crimes of some disgusting and despicable people to malign an entire population, to malign everybody brown, to malign everybody Muslim, to malign everybody of Pakistani heritage, despite, the percentages being negligible in the context of the broader population. And that, I think, might be where Elon Musk is coming from. Robert Jenrick seems to be coming from there in the last few days. This desperation to use the crimes of disgusting people to denigrate and malign entire demographics, as if, recent scandals in the Church of England rendered every Christian in the country complicit in paedophilia, as if recent scandals in the Catholic Church rendered every Catholic in the country somehow complicit in paedophilia or supportive of violent sex crimes, as if, the preponderance of DJs and television presenters that we saw being unveiled as disgusting predators over the last few years somehow taught us anything about television presenters and radio presenters who are not disgusting predators. There's a hunger to use the crimes of a small number of people to malign entire demographics. And I see that going on with Musk, but I see it very much as quite two-dimensional race hate. The kind of accounts I was telling you about last year, where you just have clip after clip after clip of people of colour committing crimes, as if no white person ever commits crime. This desperation to believe that your ethnicity is somehow indicative of your criminality. I'm talking about ethnicity, not nationality. So I don't know. That seems to me to be partly where Elon Musk is coming from. But his attacks on Keir Starmer are extraordinary. And potentially quite dangerous. You know that 2 members of parliament in this country have been assassinated in recent years. And some of the rhetoric that Elon Musk has shared about Jess Phillips could have a terrible effect upon an impressionable mind in the context of her personal safety. Some of the language that he's deployed, I'll share with you shortly, is absolutely hideous. And similarly with Keir Starmer, to accuse Keir Starmer of a sort of complicity in rape when the man as DPP literally pressed the button on the prosecution of so-called grooming gangs, letting people like Nazir Afzal, the chief prosecutor in the Northwest, go after them with absolute, I'd use the word passion, actually, for want of a better one, go after them with enthusiasm and determination. For Elon Musk to claim from a position of, I presume, Twitter-inspired ignorance, that Keir Starmer has somehow done something wrong is incredibly dangerous. And also, I don't normally go in for this sort of thing, it offends my patriotic sensibilities as well. Now, I may not have said that if I was presenting this show yesterday morning, because I'm conscious of all the people that would come crawling out of the woodwork to say, oh, you've only got a problem with him because he's such a big fan of Farage. But of course, now he's come out and said that Farage is not fit to lead reform. which means that I think you can probably say, without any fear or favour, that nobody should be listening to Elon Musk's opinions on British politics and his, I would say, pretty close to libellous maligning of our Prime Minister and the Labour politician who has done more in the arena of women's safety than arguably anybody else alive is despicable and disgusting. So who's in favour? Who's cheering him on? And then you come back to this extraordinary subculture of sewage that he has allowed to flourish on his own social media platform, who either believe it or think that there is something to be achieved by encouraging lots of other people to believe it as well. So here's the question. The first one is a bit weird. I haven't been on there much, and I'm not going back, I don't think. I'm on Blue Sky, if you're remotely interested in my occasional burblings, which is an altogether happier space where you're not really allowed. It's not brilliantly regulated because they haven't got the money, but you're not really allowed to lie. And if you don't want to see somebody's toxic bile, it's quite easy to remove them from your orbit. So explain to somebody who's not plugged into social media what Elon Musk is doing. All right, that's challenge number one, which is relatively easy if you have been paying attention. 0345 6060973. Question number two is altogether different, and I would suspect much, much harder to answer. What should Keir Starmer do about this? You have an incredibly powerful man, objectively incredibly powerful, whether you like it or not, however you dice it, however you cut it. The man is incredibly powerful. Even if it was his wealth and ownership of Twitter alone, his power would be unprecedented. But he is, of course, also a key consigliere to the incoming President of the United States of America, a regime and administration that the Labour government have made it clear they are keen to do business with, for good or for ill. I have no idea how Keir Starmer should handle this. Elon Musk is essentially painting potentially hideous targets on the back of British politicians like Jess Phillips and Keir Starmer, targets that are forged from ignorance and misinformation. But given his power, what on earth can he do? So, what has Elon Musk been up to in the context of British politics and the grooming gang scandals? 0345 6060973. And what on earth, I really need your help with the second one, by the way. What on earth should Keir Starmer do about this? How should Keir Starmer handle it? Because one of the things I've learned over the last few years is that when you're dealing with lies driven by racism, sometimes the truth doesn't touch the sides. When you're dealing with lies driven by racism, when, for example, the answer to claims about the absence of inquiries is to point out how many inquiries there have been, to point out that Alexis J, who delivered her inquiry that was called partly as a consequence of the grooming gang scandals, has insisted that the last government did nothing to implement the 20 recommendations that she made. I don't think Elon Musk even knows that. I don't think he knows that we spent tens of millions of pounds on an inquiry into child sexual abuse up and down the country, focusing on various quarters, including my old school, would you believe, got a sort of chapter of its own, but looking directly and specifically at grooming gang scandals as well, and made 20 recommendations that the last government ignored. I wonder whether Elon Musk knows that the Prime Minister, whose passage into Downing Street was generously greased by Nigel Farage, described inquiries into child sexual abuse as spaffing money up the wall, sitting largely unchallenged, I think, in this very studio, where Nigel Farage will be sitting tomorrow. It's almost as if the truth doesn't matter because the intoxicating unpleasantness that Twitter is now almost entirely made of is so powerful. So what on earth can Keir Starmer do about it? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And I mean, I'd sometimes say serious or silly answers, but it's too serious a question to admit silly answers. But by silly, I just mean left field. I mean, I think Brazil closed him down entirely, didn't they? I'm leaning to the idea that Keir Starmer should just do that. 0345 6060973 is the number you need. It's 10:18. James O'Brien on LBC. 20 minutes after 10. I'll give you a quick indication of what I mean by not being plugged into it anymore. And at this point, I'll be honest with you, given the influence Musk seeks to exert over British politics, I don't know whether it might be a mistake not to be in my job. I'd advise you against it, I think. But in my job, maybe I should be more plugged in. I have to keep checking whether it's true or not. So I see on Blue Sky a screenshot of something Elon Musk has apparently done on Twitter. And the two most notable contributions in the last 24 hours have both made me go, that's not real. Someone has faked that. The first one was Elon Musk describing Nigel Farage as being unfit to lead reform. And the second one was a question about whether or not America should liberate the people of Britain from their tyrannical government. I mean, he's actually posted that. A poll on whether America should liberate the people of Britain from their tyrannical government. To which, at 7:51 this morning, 67% of respondents had replied yes, and 33% had replied no. So the man is absolutely bonkers. But he's also, arguably, the most powerful non-elected human being on the planet. So what on earth does Keir Starmer do with a problem like Elon Musk? 22 after 10 is the time. And speaking of Keir Starmer, he's currently giving a speech about the NHS, the highlights of which we will pick up on shortly. But first, John's in Bristol. John, what do you reckon?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, John.
First of all, Happy New Year. Good to have you back.
Thank you. You too.
Yes. We had Suella Parker on for a couple of days. Don't get me started. Anyway, right, yes. Well, the thing is, James, and I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna bring up the Brexit. And you see, the thing is, we're in a position now that we have to scrabble around all over the world for a good trade deal, even to make up even a minuscule of what we've lost. We're losing 100 billion quid off the economy because of Brexit. And the thing is, as much as Starmer would probably like to tell
this is more an answer to the question of what approach Starmer should take to Trump's entire administration. I'm thinking specifically about Musk's antics on Twitter and his misinformation and provocations with regards most recently to grooming gangs and to Britain being a tyrannical government. What should he do about that, about Musk's behaviour on Twitter?
Well, obviously, Elon Musk is off his head.
Yeah, so what should Keir Starmer do about it?
Well, what he should do about it and what he will do about it are two different things. What he should do...
You're driving me nuts, mate. Answer the bloody question. I've only been back at work for 23 minutes.
James,
Carry on.
I'm asking the question.
Go on.
I'm asking the question. I'm
asking the question. You're answering the question. What should he do about Elon Musk?
He should say to Elon Musk, keep you all out of it. Keep your big nose out of British politics, and don't try to with your toxic racism and your BS.
Yeah, but he can't. He can't.
But
do
he
that.
can't.
So
but
what?
He can't do that
so what should he do?
Keep America sweet. He's got to keep stum.
So do nothing.
Do nothing. Keep stum.
I don't think he's going to do that. The Times reports today that he's about to push back against Musk's interferences and provocations. I don't know at this point exactly what that will look like, but he can't keep stum. How can he keep stum when someone is using Twitter to essentially paint targets on the back of some of his most effective politicians?
Well, what Elon Musk has said about Jess Phillips is disgusting.
Objectively disgusting. Yes.
It's objectively disgusting. The guy is why do we have this deference towards billionaires and the richest people on the planet? Like we have to accommodate them at every whim. you know.
Well, you're currently asking more questions than you're answering, but I'm going to give you some credit for mentioning Brexit in the very first call of 2025. I wonder how many calls into 2025 we can get with every single caller bringing Brexit to the table. I think that might be a challenge that even I balk at. John, take care. Happy New Year. What should he do? So his hands are tied to a degree by the power that Musk exercises, but the absurdity, the insanity, and I use that word advisedly, of questions about Britain having a tyrannical government that needs to be overthrown. Some of it is there's a phrase they use on social media, I can't really say it on the radio, but some of it is not to be taken seriously, but some of it obviously is. How should Keir Starmer deal with this? Anne's in Carmarthenshire. Anne, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah. I wanted to say, in answer to the question, what's he doing? I mean, I think possibly it's all about displacing a terrible anger that he feels.
That he feels?
That he feels, yes. Yeah. That he's unable to deal with. He's unable to deal with the actual problem that he's got. So he's displacing it, projecting it into all these other issues. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that there was a really good documentary on the BBC very recently in the past few weeks about him, Musk, his life and all the rest of it. And apparently his daughter transitioned from being a male to a female, and he cannot come to terms with it. He's extraordinarily angry about it. Now, apparently...
How does that translate into an attack on Jess Phillips?
Well, because he can't deal with the real anger. It's quite a usual psychological problem. So he's displacing it. And what I was about to say was that he was a Democrat supporter apparently in the past, and he supported Hillary Clinton's financial campaign. And I'm not sure about this. I'd have to listen to the documentary again. But about the time that this transition his daughter made from being a male to a female, at that point, apparently, he said he was going to wage war on wokery.
Yes, no, this is true. The woke mind virus. I think this is quite a well-established narrative, actually, and it takes you to a certain point. And in fact, Anne, and I mean this as a expression of gratitude, a little bit more of amateur psychological analysis of Elon Musk is actually welcome at times like this, because the alternative is just to throw your hands up in the air and go, I've got no idea what's going on. But if you see that as an entry level into self-radicalization, I maybe that sort of woke mind virus transgender entrance point leads to the online far-right radicalization that's clearly taken place since he bought Twitter. So all the accounts that he's brought back because he thought somewhat naively that it was freedom of speech to allow racist lies. I think I heard Nigel Farage making that argument at the end of Nick's show. Freedom of speech. We should all be allowed to tell racist lies. That's freedom of speech. He's now believed all of those stories and ended up in this, frankly, insane place, traumatized by his daughter's trans journey, lashing out at anybody and picking on Britain because, unfortunately, our political climate post-Brexit has become so unhitched from observable reality and so in hoc to both billionaires and racist grifters that it's hard to imagine a more fertile territory in which he can find the sort of adulation that he's clearly so desperate for. And by adulation, I find this fascinating. Because you see it with some of the previously respectable people in the British media who went doolally during lockdown and got addicted to the dopamine hits on social media, got addicted to the attention that they drew from some deeply damaged and unhappy people who ended up convinced, for example, that medicine was bad for them. And Musk, you would imagine, would be immune to that by dint of his power and wealth. But this is when I come back to the idea that he's just the uber troll. He's just the ultimate Twitter troll. And he is completely addicted, even though he needs neither the money, the attention, nor the power. He's completely addicted to the psychological dopamine hits he gets from being carried through social media on the shoulders of blue-ticked racist grifters. Maybe it's that simple. 03456060973 is the number you need. Still not a lot of answers to the question of what the hell Keir Starmer can do about this. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. So Keir Starmer has answered the question that we're asking this morning in the last few minutes. How do you deal with a problem like Elon Musk? And the tactics he's elected, as you will hear in a few seconds, are, well, I suspect the only ones he can employ. He has to tell the truth. He has to try to get the facts out there in order to deflate the provocative untruths that Musk either believes or has chosen for opportunistic reasons to disseminate. Anyone who's been listening to this programme for the last 10 or even 15 years, certainly the last 12 years, 13 years, will know all of the facts regarding grooming gangs. But where Tommy Robinson or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, to give him his proper name, has proved so adept and successful is telling people things that were already in the public domain and pretending that they weren't, and then asking for money. Up to the point where Elon Musk apparently believes that Yaxley Lennon is in jail for anything whatsoever to do with coverage of grooming gangs, when he's in jail for libeling a schoolboy repeatedly and asking you for money. So what does Starmer do? He tells the truth. Whether or not it works or not, I honestly couldn't say. 10 years ago, I'd have said this is fine. He's dealt with it now. But we're back to what Brexit has done to our country, what Trump has done to the United States of America, rendered the truth irrelevant, rendered facts alternative, rendered news fake. Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions. Andrew Norfolk was a journalist on the Times. Nazir Afzal was the Chief Prosecutor in the North West. Knit those three men together and you have a programme of prosecution that goes all the way back to 2012. But people choose not to believe that. British politicians choose not to believe that. I don't know whether the truth touches the sides at times like this. But here's quite a long clip of Keir Starmer speaking at a press conference in Surrey just a few moments ago.
But let me start with this. Child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening. Utterly sickening. And for many, many years, too many victims have been completely let down by perverse ideas about community relations, or by the idea that institutions must be protected above all else. And they've not been listened to and they've not been heard. And when I was Chief Prosecutor for 5 years, I tackled that head on because I could see what was happening. And that's why I reopened cases that had been closed and supposedly finished. I brought the first major prosecution of an Asian grooming gang. In the particular case, it was in Rochdale, but it was the first of its kind. There were many that then followed that format. I changed the whole prosecution approach because I wanted to challenge and did challenge the myths and stereotypes that were stopping those victims being heard. So we changed the entire approach, not without criticism at the time, I might add. And when I left office, we had the highest number of child sexual abuse cases being prosecuted on record. Now, that record is not secret. As a public servant, it's there for all of you or everybody to see. I also called for mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. I called for that a decade ago. The Tories did nothing about that for those 10 long years, including when the J report came out nearly 3 years ago now. Central plank, mandatory reporting, still hasn't been done. We're going to do it. But let's just to bring it in closer, and I will answer you on Jess Phillips in particular, because those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career. And so just as I took on the criminal justice system and the institutions when I was chief prosecutor. I'm prepared to call out this for what it is. We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed. I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate that we must have, but that's got to be based on facts and truth, not on lies, not on those who are so desperate for attention that they're prepared to debase themselves and their country. So this government will get on with the job of protecting victims, including child sexual abuse, mandatory reporting, accelerating the processes. But what I won't tolerate is this discussion and debate based on lies without calling it out. What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it, now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying. So that's what I say about Jess Phillips.
I think that might be the best I've heard from Keir Starmer since he became Prime Minister. Andrew writes, brilliant response from Starmer. Thank God we have a man of integrity and dignity at the helm in contradiction to the United States. Sam writes, Keir Starmer is right to keep telling the truth, and others who also care about the truth need to flood the media that they have available to them with the actual facts. Isn't there a saying that you can't roll in the muck with pigs because the pigs love it? I think I heard that somewhere. I've read that one already. So Keir Starmer says, Callum is finally starting to sound like a Prime Minister. He was a prosecutor. He should lead into that. Sometimes it's good to have politicians who used to be lawyers. He could regulate social media platforms in the same way that LBC is regulated. I mean, on it goes, actually. Well, hang on, here's one. Barry says he didn't prosecute Jimmy Savile, did he? Which is a kind of illustration of what you're left with when you make a decision to ignore the facts that Keir Starmer has just shared. I didn't know that was going to happen today, and you probably noticed that it wasn't a million miles away from the position that I was outlining for you a little earlier, shortly before he spoke. And it doesn't change the question that I'm asking, not substantively, but it changes its nuance. Because I don't know if this will work. The reason why, and I'm going to take a moment here, apologies to Jeff and Gay. It's one of those days when it always happens when I come back from a break. I used to watch this stuff a lot, all right? I used to watch these accounts on social media that are dedicated to race hate. And now, of course, Elon Musk has started giving them huge amounts of money. The more traction they get for their clips and their lies, the more money falls into their bank account at the end of every month. It's an extraordinary ecosystem that he's created, one which I felt completely repulsed by. I was repulsed by it, therefore I more or less left. I didn't expect to see the owner of it becoming part of it. I didn't expect to see the owner of it becoming, if you like, the mothership of this viciousness. And of course, the point you always have to remember, and it doesn't quite fall under contempt for the con men, compassion for the conned, is that lots of people actually believe this stuff. You see, it's not just about the grift. It's not just about the liars who are asking you for money all the time. People believe it. The only response to some of the details of the crimes that have been committed in places like Rotherham and Telford is disgust and horror and fury. You saw during the Farage riots in the summer where that disgust and horror and fury can lead if deeply irresponsible, dangerous, opportunistic people abandon the truth and focus entirely upon the provocation and the rhetoric. I think that politicians that Starmer referred to there are playing with exactly the same fires that broke out during the Farage riots. I don't know whether they realise what they're doing, but you saw what could happen when the truth is abandoned at the altar of race hate or refugee hate or whatever it may be. When trials are, of course, forthcoming, so you have to be careful what you say, but when the facts are abandoned in pursuit of racist rhetoric, many people taking to the streets, setting fire to hotels and worse, believe that they're doing good work. They believe, some of them, believe that they're doing good work. So Starmer needs to reach corners of the country that he's failed to reach thus far. I don't know if he can. I don't want to sound bleak. I don't know if he can. I think sometimes lies are so powerful and so toxic that the truth, as they say, can barely get its trousers on before they're halfway around the world. So your response to Keir Starmer's words, all fact-based. A point for Dazza. Dazza's been in touch. He says, James needs to start listening to GB News and remove himself from mainstream BBC, and then he might get the other side to these stories. So phone-in show, Dazza. You can give me a bell and tell me what the other side to these stories is. I tell you that Andrew Norfolk started reporting this stuff in 2011. You tell me the other side to that story. I tell you that Nazir Afzal, the chief prosecutor in the Northwest, saw Andrew Norfolk's reports in the Times and decided to reopen cases against some of the grooming gangs in 2012. You can give me a ring now, Dazza, and tell me what the other side of that story is. I can tell you that Nazir Afzal has personally and repeatedly praised Keir Starmer, who was Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, for literally changing policies and making it easier to pursue prosecutions, lowering the bar, if you like, for pursuing prosecutions. You give me a ring, Dazza, and tell me what the other side to that story is, the other side to recorded historic reality. You give me a ring and tell me what it is that I'm missing. Because those are the facts. And yet Elon Musk, so powerful, so rich, so dangerous, is helping people spread what, of course, Donald Trump's former Director of Communications, Kellyanne Conway, elected to call alternative facts all over our country, to the point where the Prime Minister has to deal with it at a press conference. That's why I'm worried. How do you think he should handle it? And now we can add to the mix this question. How do you think he did just handle it? It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48. I think Starmer's gone a little bit further on the failure of the Conservative Party, in particular, Kemi Badenoch, specifically to condemn Elon Musk. Disgusting opportunism is the kindest way I can think of to describe what she's doing at the moment, because she knows what Jess Phillips' record is on protecting women. She knows what Keir Starmer's record is on prosecuting grooming gangs. She knows that the Tories have been in power for 14 years, up until the middle of last year. So the idea that somehow the Labour Party should have done an unspecified more in this field is laughable. But disgusting opportunism seems to be her middle name. The language used about Phillips, about Jess Phillips, is hideous, actually. And I'll play you the clip of Starmer addressing that more directly shortly. But we are looking at, well, we started the show today asking how Keir Starmer should handle Elon Musk. And now we can add to that what you think of how Keir Starmer is now handling Elon Musk. Because for my money, that was the best thing he could do. But I don't know whether it's enough, which becomes the marriage of the two questions, doesn't it? What do we think of what he's doing? What do we think he should do? And do we think it's going to work? Jeff's in Woking. Jeff, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Jeff.
Happy New Year.
Same
I hope
to
you had
you.
a good break.
Had a lovely break. Have you ever been to the Italian-Turkish border?
I've been to Italy, but not to the Turkish border.
Oh,
no.
a beautiful part of the world. It's a lovely big wall you can look at. It's an absolute... this is going over your head, isn't it? You weren't listening to my holiday cover. So I will move quickly on, Jeffrey. What do you want to say about Keir Starmer?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to say. As for what Elon Musk is doing, I'm outraged that he should try to affect the outcome of the next general election. And worse, he's trying to determine who the leader of that party should be. Now,
why? Why do you think he's doing that?
Well, he seems to think that probably the Reform Party is probably the nearest party politically wise to him and the American Trump regime that this is going.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. And that is just that then, the attacks on Keir Starmer, whether they are well, then they're clearly not true, but they just fall into that category completely. It just becomes part of the we'll get our people in there, whatever it takes, and the truth be damned.
Yes, now I think there are other things that Sir Keir Starmer can do to prevent this situation, and I think it will have the support of all the other parties in Westminster, including possibly Reform. And these measures should be that Sir Keir should get some legislation in place that, first of all, caps the amount of money that a person or organisation can donate under £1 million. Also, that the person should be a UK citizen, and they should be vetted to see that they're not members of any proscribed organisation, and also that the liable laws.
Do you think that Musk turning on Farage actually gives Starmer an opportunity to look at the funding problem in a way that would have been tricky if they were still waiting for this massive cheque that Musk was supposedly going to write for them? I mean, I saw Farage yesterday claiming that he never abandons his principles. I found myself wondering about the principle that he shared when Barack Obama offered up an evidence-based analysis of what Brexit would do to this country, and he said foreign politicians should keep out of British politics, and now he's happy for unelected foreign politicians to write enormous cheques in support of his own party. So leaving aside the moral bankruptcy of Nigel Farage, does Starmer have an opportunity now to bring in funding changes without any accusations of trying to shoot Farage's fox?
Well, I don't think Nigel will be quite so keen on Mr. Musk anymore, that he's
we'll see.
That he's put his fingers up to him as being the leader of the party. So Nigel Farage may be as unhappy with Musk as the other parties are.
Well, we'll see. I don't know about that. I think that giving him an opportunity to distance himself from Tommy Robinson while sort of doing that nudge and a wink to Tommy Robinson supporters it may actually have worked slightly in his favour. And the one thing you can always say about Farage is, regardless of the subject, whatever it may be, he will just be simply delighted that he is being talked about. With that little hiatus during the summer when he got so cross about people referring to the riots that followed, much of the misinformation that he helped disseminate online, when people started referring to them as the Farage riots, he was very, very unhappy about that. So we must stop doing that, by the way. Starmer was asked directly whether he interpreted Elon Musk's words as a direct attack from the Trump administration, which plays slightly into Jeff's point. It's worth listening to his response in full.
I'm actually making a more general point. I'm not going to individualise this to Elon Musk or anybody else. I'm making more because actually I'm very concerned about where the Tory party is going on this in this country, because they are not. I think only a few months ago it would have been unthinkable for things to have been said about Jess Phillips that was said recently without all political parties and the leader of the opposition calling it out in terms. I genuinely believe that. I don't think it was that long ago that you would have all expected that reaction. You'd have all been challenging the leader of the opposition. Will you denounce this? This isn't fair, because it's put a member of Parliament, my member of Parliament, at risk. That's not good. That's why I say a line's been crossed. So this isn't about America or Musk. I'm talking about our politics. I'm talking about the responsibility that our politicians have in calling this out for what it is and distancing themselves and condemning it. Because if you're not prepared to stand up as a Tory MP and denounce what's been said about Jess Phillips, who's now had threats made to her, then you need to seriously consider why you're in politics in the first place, in my view.
I think he's making a point there that is very specific to Kemi Badenoch, and with a little side order of honest Bob Jenrick, who's, I would say, on recent form, publicly further to the right now than Farage is, which is an extraordinary achievement, but one which, forgive me, I've been predicting for some time. Either the Tory party moves back towards the middle or it tries to outflank Farage on race baiting. But that idea that the Tories would have called this out, I think is probably true. I think Rishi Sunak would not have let that pass. Boris Johnson, less so. Liz Truss, who knows? You'd have asked her what she thought about Donald Trump and she'd have replied, cheese and baked beans, please. Who was before that? Theresa May, definitely, I think. You just wouldn't, especially as a female politician. I know Liz Truss is also a female politician, but You take my point. Theresa May, when shown evidence of one of Donald Trump's key allies essentially painting a hideous target on the back of Jess Phillips, would not have let it pass. I don't know about Johnson even. No, you don't think he'd have done the right thing? I know that, look, even a stop clock is right twice a day. Maybe Boris Johnson would have behaved with some semblance of decency and morality on that one. No, all right then, I'll let that pass. But Sunak would have done, right? Let's run through my holiday cover as well, shall we? Jeremy Hunt would have done, should have done, still might actually. Did he do it while he was on air, or the comments not dropped by that point? It was more over the weekend. Suella Braverman, unlikely. I think we can all agree to come out and condemn Elon Musk's lies, even though it endangers Jess Phillips. Who else came in on me? Who was the other? James Cleverly. I suffer from this terrible generosity of spirit. I'd like to think James Cleverly might condemn this, but I don't know. I don't understand why they haven't. But you describe Jess Phillips, who genuinely dedicated her professional life, certainly her political life, to child and particularly women protection. He comes out and calls her a rape genocide apologist. I mean, the unhingedness of it is unprecedented. But May and Sunak, I think, would have called this out by now. Gay is in Bath. Gay, what would you like to say?
Good morning and welcome back.
Thank you.
Do you know what? Keir Starmer, I'm sure, is a very nice man, but he does strike me as being a bit weak and looks like he's going to burst into tears every time he looks into a camera, which is one thing. But we mustn't forget that we wouldn't be in this mess now if, say, Merrick Garland had arrested Donald Trump very shortly after the Capitol riots.
These ships have sailed, haven't they?
Yeah, 4 years ago today. But I just think that it feels like they're almost testing the water for all European rulers or politicians to find out who the weak ones are. And I just think, trying not to be too rude, but I think I'd tell Elon Musk where to go.
Yes. I mean, he kind of has. In terms this morning. I don't know how long you've been on hold, but I think some of your points perhaps have been slightly undermined by the strength of his response, particularly on the Jess Phillips front and the failure of the Tories. I mean, what does Kemi Badenoch think she's playing at, sitting there and letting Elon Musk essentially incite hatred against a sitting female politician?
They all are. And if you think about it, with Trump, when he started having a go at the Mexican president, and she bit back. He's backed off her completely. When he had a go at Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago with his tail between his legs. So, you know, who've got the cojones around here?
Well, yeah, difficult dynamics. No, you may be right. Oh, so, yeah, we need a fit. Well, not Kemi Badenoch either. No. But so what? I mean, cojones is a very felicitous word, but it doesn't translate into immediate policy. What do you think he should do beyond what he's already done this morning?
Oh, God knows. But I just wish I just cannot believe that it's come to this.
Oh, well, there's a book you should read, Gay, I'm afraid. It lays it out in crystal clear form, not only how it's come to this, but why it was quite possibly inevitable. But I think my New Year's resolution should be not to plug my own book until at least the second show of the year, so I won't tell you what book that is. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do we move on to that Tory angle now? Do we look at whether or not the Tories should be doing more to deal with this? Do we carry on talking about whether Keir Starmer's response is correct, or do we park it and move into newer territory, looking perhaps more specifically at the calls for a child sexual abuse inquiry that seem to me to be coming from people who are either ignorant of or pretending not to know about all the previous inquiries that have already unfolded, both on a local and indeed a national scale. Find out after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
This is interesting as well. I've said to you a few times over the last few years, all you can do is keep telling the truth. That there is, in many ways, no other alternative to alternative facts except the truth. All you can do is keep telling the truth. And goodness me, it's been a tricky time for the truth, hasn't it? Especially perhaps with the re-election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States, a man who has turned lying into an art form, both in his personal, professional and political lives. But in some ways, when I say to you, what should Keir Starmer do? There's only one answer to that question. He has to keep telling the truth. There's policy decisions he could make. He could remove government business from X, from Twitter. He could perhaps ban it or regulate it, as they tried to do, as I think they successfully did in Brazil, just shut it down. I don't know. It feels a bit authoritarian. So what can he do? Answer, tell the truth. And also make that point about the body politic. Make that point about the united country. You know, I want to share with you something Dominic Grieve has done. Dominic Grieve, of course, was Attorney General when Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecution. Dominic Grieve, a Conservative. This is. I sometimes when something happens live on the show, I can't articulate my feelings immediately. But what he just said, what Starmer just said about Badenoch's failure to come to Jess Phillips' defence, and then some of the hideous henchmen like Honest Bob Jenrick and Chris Philp, sorry. That is a real mark of how low the Tories have been brought post-Johnson. Because here's Dominic Grieve. So Musk tweets the following. In the UK, serious crimes such as rape require the Crown Prosecution Service's approval for the police to charge suspects. Who was the head of the CPS when rape gangs were allowed to exploit young girls without facing justice? Keir Starmer, 2008 to 2013. I mean, a position of such demonstrable ignorance that if it was an ordinary Twitter troll, you wouldn't give it the time of day. But it's a man seeking to influence British politics at every conceivable level. Dominic Grieve, Conservative Attorney General, responds in terms. He writes, the Crown Prosecution Service does indeed have to give approval for police to charge suspects in serious crimes. But where is the evidence that when Keir Starmer was DPP, the CPS wrongly refused such consents in rape and child grooming cases? Answer, there is none. On the contrary, Starmer was proactive in focusing on this type of crime, as Nazir Afzal has correctly highlighted. There's a reason why I keep saying these three names: Keir Starmer, Nazir Afzal, Andrew Norfolk. They may well have been failures to address this issue elsewhere through reporting and investigation, but that is not the role of the CPS. Baseless innuendo does not contribute to serious debate. So, if you wanted to be really cynical about it, you could argue that Starmer's failure has been to not politicise his prosecution of grooming gangs. You could, I think, quite powerfully argue that Starmer's decision not to politicise it has left the space open to people who are desperate to do so. In this case, Elon Musk, but historically, of course, many other characters as well. Which brings us to the fourth point of the square I keep referring to today. Andrew Norfolk, who broke these stories in 2011 when Stephen Yaxley Lennon was still running a sunbed salon in Luton. Or committing mortgage fraud. It's so hard to keep up. So you've got Andrew Norfolk, who broke these stories. You've got Nazir Afzal, who noticed and went to war against grooming gangs. You've got Keir Starmer, who helped him to do so. And then the fourth point of the square is Professor Alexis Jay, who's conducted two very specific inquiries, one into grooming gangs in Rotherham and one into child sexual abuse, institutional child sexual abuse, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse up and down the country. And what does she have to say today? Two things. The first is, please implement the recommendations I made in the report that was published in 2022, something else that only the Tories can account for. And number two, stop politicising sexual violence and stop spreading misinformation. So what can you do? All you can do is tell the truth. But of course, Keir Starmer would not, could not, and did not politicise his role. He can simply point out what he's done. He can't turn himself into some sort of caped crusader, even though the facts are almost entirely on his side. I say almost entirely because there will be, and there is at least one recorded case of when, in retrospect, I think he probably would have preferred to pursue a prosecution, but it was instead dropped, although his team say that particular case in 2009 did not reach the DPP's office. The big problem underpinning all of this is a problem you won't hear Elon Musk speak about at all. It is a problem of not believing victims. It is a problem of when people come forward they are treated with scepticism and cynicism, and in some cases worse. And that doesn't matter whether they are reporting takeaway workers and minicab drivers in Rotherham, or teachers at their very expensive public schools, or priests at their summer camps. The key problem that underpins child sexual abuse in all its myriad forms, and remember the massive majority of it takes place in families, is that victims are not believed. And none of these people trying to make political capital or get clicks and dollars on Twitter, none of these people seem to be remotely concerned about any of that. So look at what Alexis J has to say. Look at the work that Andrew Norfolk has been doing for 14 years on the Times newspaper. Look at what Nazir Afzal did as chief prosecutor in the Northwest. There's an episode of Full Disclosure with him that you can listen to if you're not aware of what he's done. And listen to what he says about his boss at the time, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer. And then have a look at what Dominic Grieve has to say directly to Elon Musk, who is using his own enormous social media platform to spread lies and nonsense, while Nigel Farage is applauding him for somehow being a champion and a hero of free speech. Free speech. Here's a massive lie. Oh, up with free speech. Here's a dangerous attack upon a serving British politician in a country where 2 have been assassinated in recent years, one by a member of the far right. And where are the Tories? Where's Kemi Badenoch condemning the incitement of hatred against Jess Phillips? Where is she? I say it before and I'll say it again. I think Sunak would have done it, and I think Theresa May would have done it, and the jury's out on whether Boris Johnson or Liz Truss would have had the basic common decency to do so. So I'm staying with this, and we're moving the conversation slightly into your direct responses. We don't do this very often because it's happened live on air. Your direct responses to how Keir Starmer is dealing with this problem. The first clip's quite long, so pay proper attention because this is important.
But let me start with this. Child sexual exploitation is utterly sickening. Utterly sickening. And for many, many years, too many victims have been completely let down by perverse ideas about community relations, or by the idea that institutions must be protected above all else. And they've not been listened to and they've not been heard. And when I was chief prosecutor for 5 years, I tackled that head on because I could see what was happening. And that's why I reopened cases that had been closed and supposedly finished. I brought the first major prosecution of an Asian grooming gang. In the particular case, it was in Rochdale, but it was the first of its kind. There were many that then followed that format. I changed the whole prosecution approach because I wanted to challenge and did challenge the myths and stereotypes that were stopping those victims being heard. So we changed the entire approach, not without criticism at the time, I might add. And when I left office, we had the highest number of child sexual abuse cases being prosecuted on record. Now, that record is not secret. As a public servant, it's there for all of you or everybody to see. I also called for mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. I called for that a decade ago. The Tories did nothing about that for those 10 long years, including when the J report came out nearly 3 years ago now. Central plank, mandatory reporting, still hasn't been done. We're going to do it. But let's just to bring it in closer, and I will answer you on Jess Phillips in particular, because those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career. And so just as I took on the criminal justice system and the institutions when I was chief prosecutor. I'm prepared to call out this for what it is. We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed. I enjoy the cut and thrust of politics, the robust debate that we must have, but that's got to be based on facts and truth, not on lies, not on those who are so desperate for attention that they're prepared to debase themselves and their country. So this government will get on with the job of protecting victims, including child sexual abuse, mandatory reporting, accelerating the processes. But what I won't tolerate is this discussion and debate based on lies without calling it out. What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it, now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying. So that's what I say about Jess Phillips.
And of course, he went on to target the failure of previously respectable Conservative politicians to join in this condemnation. I'll play you that shortly. But remember, if Elon Musk says that Jess Phillips should be jailed, and calls her hideous names, all built entirely on lies, all it takes is one impressionable, vulnerable mind to be bent, to be twisted by his rhetoric. And Lord only knows where that leads, but still they stay silent. Nothing from Badenoch, words almost of support. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. And before we listen to the other clip and dive into what you think of Starmer's handling of this crisis, I'd also remind you, I keep mentioning Andrew Norfolk, who started reporting on this stuff in the Times in 2011, 2012. Adil Ray, British Pakistani Muslim journalist, made a documentary about these gangs in 2011. The late Channel 4 journalist Tazeen Ahmed also did extraordinary work in this field long before Tommy Robinson moved from mortgage fraud to contempt of court. The claims that people haven't tried their best to address these problems. We did it on this show from 2011, 2012 onwards, repeatedly. But of course, all the people crawling out of the woodwork now are interested in neither the truth nor the actual victims. One wonders when the documentary is looking into long-standing sexual abuse cases in the Catholic Church or the Church of England will be broadcast, or indeed used to claim that every Christian in the country is somehow alien or of an inferior culture. It's 11:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Here's a very interesting message from Roger before we continue. I blame social media. Some important people never realised the extent to which they were despised, and suddenly they were confronted with it on a daily basis. Musk's response to not being accepted by the cool artistic circle is to burn the whole thing down. If there is any history after his eventual demise, it will portray him, like all dictators, as a pathetic loser. Why can't we just miss out the bit where he destabilises the world as we know it for his own private amusement, like some kind of Bond villain? And here is, for me, a pivotal point in Keir Starmer's premiership and a pivotal point in Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Tory party. One emerges with credit, one cloaked in unfathomable shame.
I'm actually making a more general point. I'm not going to individualise this to Elon Musk or anybody else. I'm making more because actually I'm very concerned about where the Tory party is going on this in this country, because they are not. I think only a few months ago it would have been unthinkable for things to have been said about Jess Phillips that was said recently, without all political parties and the leader of the opposition calling it out in terms. I genuinely believe that. I don't think it was that long ago that you would have all expected that reaction. You'd have all been challenging the leader of the opposition. Will you denounce this? This isn't fair, because it's put a member of parliament, my member of parliament, at risk. That's not good. That's why I say a line's been crossed. So this isn't about America or Musk. I'm talking about our politics. I'm talking about the responsibility that our politicians have in calling this out for what it is and distancing themselves and condemning it. Because if you're not prepared to stand up as a Tory MP and denounce what's been said about Jess Phillips, who's now had threats made to her, then you need to seriously consider why you're in politics in the first place, in my view.
She's already, I missed that the first time round, she's already had threats made against her. My apologies for suggesting that it was inevitable as opposed to actual fact already. 22 after 11 is the time. So how's he doing? Started the morning asking what he should do. Now we wonder what we think of what he is doing. Jacob is in Dublin. Jacob, what would you like to say?
I'm not being funny. Hi, James, by the way. I'm not being funny. That speech you've been playing throughout this last segment, boring as hell. And I'm trying to listen to it, and I'm trying to pay attention, but the dude just has no pizzazz. And when you're talking about it in this context, when you're talking about him in response to what is essentially the cool kid riding in on a skateboard with a backwards cap, slagging off your mum, that ain't going to cut it. Like, it ain't going to cut it at all. And I'm not saying he could do this, but there needs to be somebody who can sling mud back at the people who are slinging mud.
Well, and then who's right then? Who has where's morality left?
Well, you see, this is it. You're talking about it from the aspect of Queensberry rules.
No, I'm an expert on the dangers of turning up with a copy of the Queensberry Rules to a knife fight. But Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So, I mean, rhetoric aside, and winning analogies about skateboarders aside, what does getting dirty look like?
Getting dirty looks like is hiring somebody else who he can have plausible deniability, or at least use as a scapegoat if it gets a little bit too hot. Somebody who can go out into the public eye, say the things that he's not able to, and call Elon Musk. What things? Okay, for example, Elon Musk comes in and starts, well, essentially, for lack of a better description, slagging off the UK government about their behaviours towards this type of stuff. Point anything else. Point out his hypocrisy. He's joined a country that has its own history with some particular sex scandals in the last X amount of years.
It's not the job of politicians. I can do that. You can do that. It's not the job of a
politician. I agree. That's what I'm saying. You need to hire somebody. I mean, he needs to hire somebody like you, even. Somebody who is able to articulately dismantle the opposite side. Because you're not
I liked the speeches today. I take your point, and you're absolutely welcome to lob rotten tomatoes at them, but at some point the truth has to prevail, and he's just calmly and dully telling the truth. You want someone to come into the picture and start lobbing abuse at Elon Musk. I mean, I can't help thinking Elon Musk would relish that. And remember, where do you do it? You've led us into territory that I've been exploring for years now. Where do you do that? Because you can't do it on Twitter. He'll shut you down. So what you're essentially saying with your Queensberry Rules analogy is that Elon Musk owns the boxing ring and you're going to sit in row Z shouting little insults at the top of your voice. That's not going to achieve anything.
I mean,
he owns the boxing ring. He owns the boxing ring. So I'm taking your Queensberry Rules analogy and I'm shoving it where the sun don't shine, Jacob. That's the problem.
Queensberry, obviously.
Well, exactly that. That's the problem here, though, isn't it? Because I think I disagree with you. I think the speech today was really good. I think it was exactly what was needed.
No, I do think it was
my
good.
worry is where it reaches, where it gets. Because I can't. There's no point me going on Twitter anymore to make the points that I'm making to you because my algorithm's completely broken. I can scroll endless. I never see messages that are directed to me unless they're dripping with racist vitriolic abuse. He's broken it, but he still owns the boxing ring. So where does Starmer take the fight that you describe, if not into the arena that Elon Musk owns?
Well, there is other avenues. There's other social medias. There's YouTube. There's your Blue Sky. That's gaining traction. There's you on the radio.
It's not touching the sides at the moment.
No, not to the same. But I mean, there's only. eventually, hopefully, it will reach to at least
this is the crux.
Height.
This is the crux of it all. This is the crux of it all. Is that and this is why that message I read out a moment ago from Roger about social media being at the very, very root of all of this is that the truth doesn't matter. For the people sharing these, huh?
I mean, it doesn't. You're right. It doesn't matter. So holding it up and showing people as if it's going to convince them, and granted, I understand your point on where you're going to present this.
Yeah.
But you're appealing to the crowd. There has to be hire a publicist, hire somebody who can answer this question.
The truth has to prevail. Doesn't it?
You say it has to, but no, not in this modern world. You've already said numerous times.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, that's the tension. That's the tension I live with. God forbid I ever write another book, but it would probably be about that. How do you deal with the legacy of alternative facts? Once Kellyanne Conway hit that button and people were given permission to believe what they want, when clowns like Farage can claim that it's somehow freedom of speech that is being upheld, when people are given permission to lie and lie and lie again, up to and including, of course, lies in the summer that incited attempts to set fire to buildings containing human beings, where does the truth prevail? Maybe Jacob has a point. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe the Starmer administration needs to hire Malcolm Tucker Mark 7, who will just go in with all guns blazing. But go in where? What does that look like? I do not know. Thank you, Jacob. Always a fan of a winning analogy. Robert's in Birmingham. Robert, what would you like to say?
You've just stolen my point, James.
Which
with
one?
The boxing ring.
Oh, you were not going to say that about him.
I wasn't going to say the boxing ring, but I was going to say I don't think people are taking Elon Musk serious enough. And I think with what Starmer did today shows that he is, because that man is becoming so powerful. He's got himself into the US government. He's trying to infiltrate UK politics. He runs the skies with his satellites. He's running your car with automation. He's trying to get robots into your house. And he's running the biggest social media platform. And like you say, I've had it too, running the algorithms where I unfollowed Elon Musk, but I was still getting a For You, and this is recommended for you.
Yeah.
And if we let this carry on, he's going to be such a powerful man.
There's two universes. Yeah. There will be people listening to this and they're getting in touch with me, and my job is to try and build a bridge between the two universes, for whom almost all of this has completely passed them by. For two reasons. One, because they're not on social media, or because they no longer get their news from traditional sources. So they can go in two ways. They can either be ambivalent and ignorant about all of this, or they can be getting their news from unhealthy and dishonest sites and believing all sorts of nonsense. So you've got that completely weird dichotomy between two universes, in one of which this is the most important thing going on, which you've just brilliantly articulated, and in another, people would not even be sure who Elon Musk was. Isn't he the guy that makes the electric cars? I don't know.
It's true. It's true.
It's mad, isn't it?
Can I ask you something?
Yeah,
can I ask you something? You said about how you think it was Mexico that have banned Twitter. Is that right?
No, it was Brazil. They banned it, and then I think
there would be
unbanned
a way, like you say, you don't want this or this dictatorship in this country. But would there be a way where it could be banned, but Elon Musk would have to come off his own platform?
I don't think so. I'm very flattered that you'd think I'd know the answer to that question, Robert, but I haven't got a scoop.
I'm not massive on that kind of technology, but I just wondered if that was a thing, rather than
because it's self-regulated. This is the mad thing about it. This is why Farage talking about freedom of speech is so disgusting and disingenuous, because the accounts he brought back that had been banned were the proven liars.
Yeah.
And that's what this
he's doing it himself.
far-right conflation of free speech is. We need to be free to tell lies. If they can't tell lies, they've got nothing. We saw that in the summer. We saw what they can do when their lies go unchallenged. When, you could end up in prison having pleaded guilty to a hideous crime in this country while not having been closed down on Twitter.
And just allowed to say what you want.
Yeah.
And I think
that's freedom of speech in Farage's universe.
I think the government thing, him buddying up with Trump, is a test. And the test, he did it. He's in. He's through. Right, where do I go next? Where can I go to get people on my side? He's obviously met Farage, and they don't agree on everything. So he's going to try Robinson. And Robinson will go, yep, you do what you want here, mate. You give me the money, we'll work this together. And then we've got here.
Which would actually be fine. Even with all the money in the world, Robinson's never going to get above 3 or 4% in any political scenario. The alternative analysis of what you describe, the reality you describe, is that this does Farage a favour because it allows him to pretend that he's somehow not quite as toxic as some of his fellow travellers. And that's why Jenrick's intervention is so interesting, because he's gone further than Enoch Powell in the last 48 hours. I mean, who could possibly have seen that coming? Apart from all the children who, of course, had the murals removed from the wall of the processing centre for unaccompanied child asylum seekers, because honest Bob Jenrick was worried that was all a little bit too welcoming. Thank you, Robert. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:35. Listen, I told you I wasn't really following it because I can't, even if I wanted to. My profile on Twitter has been completely corrupted by events, dear boy, events. But when I was speculating a moment ago, I think rather generously on whether or not Liz Truss might have done what I think almost any other politician, any other Conservative leader prior to Boris Johnson would have done, including Theresa May and David Cameron, and condemned an attack by a foreign plutocrat upon a serving British politician for an attack based on lies. I honestly did give the benefit of the doubt to Boris Johnson and a bit of the benefit of the doubt to Liz Truss, thinking they probably would have done better than Kemi Badenoch. It turns out that in the case of Truss, I was quite hideously wrong, for which I apologise. I up to a point, because I don't want to go back into this sewer. But Liz Truss not only fails to condemn the attacks on Jess Phillips, but actually commits them. Writing, "This is Jess Phillips, the same Home Office minister who excused masked Islamist thugs. Her title, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls, is a perversion of the English language. It's clear whose side she is on." I need to, again, I've said to you a few times, I have to check this is real. Yeah. Elon Musk replies she deserves to be in prison. I would welcome Liz Truss into this studio with Jess Phillips, and they can compare notes on what they've done in the course of their political careers to safeguard women and girls. I don't do this kind of thing very often, but I think it's important. If Liz Truss wants to back up her words, I'll make room on this programme for her presuming Jess Phillips agrees as well. They can come in with their track records on what they have done in the course of their political careers to safeguard women and girls against violence and sexual abuse. I'll even invite in an impartial referee. I'll just sit here and do the weather and the travel news. I am supremely confident that if you ask Jess Phillips to turn up with everything she's done in this field and Liz Truss to turn up with everything she's done, the photographs would look a little bit like that time David Davis turned up in the European Union negotiations to talk about Brexit, when the other side had filing cabinets full of detail and he had a smile. I mean this, from one Sunday Times best-selling author to another, which is laughably the description she's applied to herself on her Twitter account. You come on the show, seriously, with Jess Phillips and compare notes on who's done the most. And then perhaps you can explain what you mean when you say it's clear whose side she is on. That, and this is what I mean about missing stuff. I've seen Jenrick's comments, which were, as I've said, slightly to the right of Enoch Powell, disgusting, opportunistic, disgraceful. You kind of expect. But this, I think, might be the worst thing I've seen from a British politician in all the years that I've been doing this job, including Boris Johnson. I can't believe my eyes. And that's what I mean about missing it. That's what I was talking to Robert about a moment ago, about there being two universes. One in which this is the only story in town and another in which you're barely noticing it. A former British Prime Minister actively encouraging attacks on a serving British politician for declining a request for an inquiry that was declined in 2022 by the Tories. There have been inquiries in Oldham. The head of the National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse has said we don't need any more inquiries. We just need the full implementation of the recommendations that I made in my report in 2022. But Liz Truss there, it doesn't happen to me very often. It very rarely happens live on air. You know when your mouth starts watering a bit because you think you're going to be sick? That's absolutely disgusting. God forbid anything happens to Jess Phillips in the coming days, weeks or months. God forbid. But if it does. But I mean it. Come on the show. Compare notes. You bring your track record, you bring your case files, bring your constituency records on what you've done to safeguard women and girls over the course of your political career. And Jess Phillips can sit over there and she'll bring hers. And we'll just compare. We'll just do it with a ruler. We could just measure the pile of the paperwork. And that is a genuine and a sincere invitation. That is a proper offer, because the British people deserve better than this, not just from a normal politician, but from a former Prime Minister. She deserves to be in prison, writes Elon Musk, consigliere to a man who's got 34 felony convictions. And God knows how many other legal problems about to be swept under the carpet as a consequence of him being elected, as a consequence in part of Musk using Twitter as a propaganda tool for Donald Trump. So seriously, the people of this country deserve better than that. So we'll compare. We'll compare Truss's track record on safeguarding women and girls against violence and sexual abuse with Liz Truss's, and we'll see who's done the most. I feel like going home now and just leaving it on hold, waiting for her to get in touch. That is absolutely disgusting. 11:41 is the time. Back to the question of how Keir Starmer is dealing with this very serious, and I think any attempts or any feeling, any inkling, God, that's really got me now. Any inkling at 2 minutes after 10 this morning, should we be going in as hard? Should we be dead? Do we deny them the oxygen? I know that the Times reports today that part of Starmer's calculation is not to make direct attacks on Elon Musk because it might give him more oxygen. Also, sensitivities about his closeness to Donald Trump. But, you know, there's no such sensitivities in the case of Liz Truss. That is absolutely despicable. Jenrick can malign the entire British Pakistani community without mentioning, of course, the members of his own party that fall into that category. But Truss there has joined in attacks upon an identifiable female politician who's already received threats. Now, she's only been in the job for 6 months. How long were the Tories in power? This is dark, man. This is really dark. And it's all still, in many places, being reported in a business-as-usual kind of way, you know? Ray's in Vauxhall. Ray, back to Starmer. What do you think?
Yes, hi James. I think, look, I think that whatever it is, the 15 or 20% of people that still currently are behind Labour would have thought that was a great speech. I believe, though, that the 80 other percent would have problems with it. And here's what I think, is that it sounds like instead of responding to Elon Musk, he's now flipping his attacks to the Tories, which to me doesn't make much sense, because the problem here is Elon Musk.
There's two clips. The 4.5 minute one was about Elon Musk, and the 1 minute 20 second one was about the failure of other politicians to come out and condemn the attacks on Jess Phillips, more as a question of parliamentary principle than as a question of partisanship.
Fair enough, but the problem he's got is that he's being attacked by an outsider who's aligned to the future US president. He's being attacked personally, as well as members of his cabinet, and he's not addressing it. And it just sounds like now that he is now instead fishing for opportunities to attack his opponents.
But you're just saying the same. You're saying the wrong thing you said before again. He spent almost all of the relevant parts of the press conference today going after Musk, going after the lies, going after the misinformation. And then as an afterthought, in the Q&A afterwards, he pointed out that the Tories have failed to condemn the attacks on their parliamentary colleague. So maybe you heard the clips wrongly, or you tuned in at a different time, but your description of what you're describing hasn't happened.
Right, okay, so I'm suggesting that he may have responded to a question about Musk, and the answer, he sort of flipped of saying, I'm not going to respond to an individual person.
The first answer is about disinformation and lies. The long reflection was upon the dangers of far-right rhetoric. He brought Stephen Yaxley-Lennon into the conversation. He was clear about the source and the danger of these lies, and said no one needs to speak for Jess Phillips, and then asked another question later. He's pointed out that the reason why he believes a line has been crossed is that some of her own parliamentary colleagues, and I hadn't seen the Liz Truss thing that I just read out when I heard Starmer talking about lines being crossed. You've got Liz Truss encouraging the attacks on Jess Phillips. Not just encouraging them, committing the attacks on Jess Phillips. And you think that it's wrong of him to criticise the Tories?
No,
a former Tory Prime Minister accusing the safeguarding minister who's been in the job for 6 months, saying, you know what side she's on, in a conversation about child sexual abuse, and you're criticising Keir Starmer for pointing out the Tories' moral failure.
With due respect, James, your question was at the start of the call-in, what do you think of Keir Starmer's speech? And I'm trying to give you an answer to that.
No, but you're not. You're giving me an answer to a small answer to a question he was asked, not to the thrust, to the main body of what he has said about Elon Musk, what he has said about misinformation, what he has said about racism, what he has said about the far right, and what he has said about the lies. You're giving me a response to what he said about the Tories failing to support Jess Phillips, and I'm reminding you that that includes a former Tory Prime Minister. It seems a very, very odd nit to pick.
Well, my point was going to be that to my mind, there's a solution to this for Keir Starmer, and he's not come up with it. And the solution is have the national inquiry. Have the national inquiry.
And Professor Alexis Jay, who conducted a national inquiry into child sexual abuse, says we don't need one. We just need to implement the recommendations from the one she gave in 2022. No, it was a national inquiry into child sexual abuse. What do you know that she doesn't, Ray?
I know that to a lot of people, this matter is not settled in their minds.
No. That's reflecting again upon people who aren't across the facts. So what do you know that Professor Alexis Jay, the chair of the National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, what do you know that she doesn't?
I know that a lot of those people in Rotherham got acquitted initially by a local investigation, the local CPS.
No, they weren't. They weren't acquitted.
They were acquitted initially.
They weren't acquitted initially. There was a failure to prosecute that was reversed in 2012 by Nazir Afzal.
Yeah, 8 years later. So
how,
the question is,
how many inquiries do you think Andy Burnham has individually called in the Northwest?
I have no idea.
But you must know if you're telling me about the need for other inquiries.
I'm suggesting there should be a national coordinated inquiry.
And I'm telling you that Professor Alexis Jay, who conducted one, says, why don't you just implement the recommendations that I made in 2022? And I'm asking you what you know that she doesn't. I'm also, now that you've changed the subject, very keen to wonder why you think people like Liz Truss shouldn't be criticised. People like Kemi Badenoch shouldn't be criticised for joining in the appalling abuse of their parliamentary colleagues that Elon Musk has undertaken.
I hadn't heard Liz Truss's comments until you mentioned them 10 minutes ago.
Okay, but you're aware of Kemi Badenoch's and Robert Jenrick's?
I'm aware of Kemi Badenoch asking for a national inquiry.
Yes, but her failure to condemn the attacks of Elon Musk on Jess Phillips. And also, why did she not call for a national inquiry when the Tories were in power for 14 years while you're here?
Because she's a hypocrite. That's why.
Okay.
Yeah,
but hang on. I thought it was wrong to criticise the Tories at this time.
No, I said for Starmer. We're talking about Starmer, right?
But it's all right for you. So the Prime Minister can't criticise his political opponents at this time, but you can.
I'm saying he's looking to gain political capital when he should be dealing with Elon Musk. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, except he spent the massive bulk of the clips that we've both listened to dealing with Elon Musk. But anyway, on your jog. It's 11:48.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Come off it, James. Constantly mentioning Tommy Robinson's mortgage fraud. I committed mortgage fraud, like everyone else, by inflating my wages to look like I was getting more than I was. It was the only way I could afford a home. Number one, you need to look up what he actually did. Number two, if you'd rather I talked about the contempt of court or the assaults or the very near collapsing of a grooming gang trial that would have been a consequence of the contempt of court for which he was jailed, then we could talk about those crimes as well. I referenced the mortgage fraud because he was in the business of committing that when people like Andrew Norfolk were reporting on the grooming gangs. And of course, your man has subsequently pretended that these things were not reported while asking mugs like you to give him money. Natasha Clark was at the speech today where Ray thought Keir Starmer didn't spend enough time criticising Elon Musk. It was supposed to be about the NHS, and therefore, Natasha, I think it is with the NHS that we should begin.
Good morning, James. Yes, a new agreement between the NHS and private providers. That's what Sir Keir Starmer wanted to talk about today. He wants to drive down those waiting lists. We know they're at record highs, more than 7 million people waiting to be seen by the NHS at the moment. So Keir Starmer has promised that 92% of them will now be seen by the end of the Parliament within that 18-week target, which is just not being met at the moment. He wants to see more diagnostic centres and scans open 7 days a week. He hopes that is going to meet those targets and to get them down quicker. He earlier today, speaking at a hospital in Epsom, defended the use of private providers to try and get more people the help they need even quicker.
Our approach must be totally unburdened by dogma. Working people will expect nothing less. So today, I welcome a new agreement that will expand the relationship between the NHS and the private healthcare sector, make the spaces, the facilities and resources of private hospitals more readily available to the NHS. That's more beds, more operations, more care, available to the NHS, treating patients free at the point of use, targeted at where we need them most. A partnership in the national interest, cutting waiting times, working for you, delivering our plan for change. Now, I know some people won't like this, but I make no apologies. Change is urgent. I'm not interested in putting ideology before patients.
So Keir Starmer says that's going to mean more beds, more operations, more choice about exactly where we get our NHS care from. But it's a hugely ambitious task, James. According to the IFS, the last time the NHS met that target of seeing 92% of patients within 18 weeks, that was back in 2015. And already critics are coming out of the woodwork today saying, well, what about GPs? What about recruitment of healthcare staff? And what about ambulance wait times? All of those things are going to have to be deprioritised, of course, if the NHS is going to focus on this instead. But like you've been talking about all hour, James, this press conference was completely dominated by Elon Musk's recent attacks on the Prime Minister over those grooming gangs. But the Prime Minister went all in and defended his record against Elon Musk's accusations.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career. And so just as I took on the criminal justice system and the institutions when I was chief prosecutor, I'm prepared to call out this for what it is. We've seen this playbook many times, whipping up of intimidation and threats of violence, hoping that the media will amplify it. Now, Jess Phillips does not need me or anybody else to speak on her behalf. But when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed.
lies and misinformation. That's how the Prime Minister described some of those attacks over those accusations about child sexual abuse. Really some incredibly punchy language from the Prime Minister, really going all in, as I think he needed to hit back at some of the absolute bile that's been coming out on X, Elon Musk's platform, about the Prime Minister and about his ministers, including Jess Phillips. And the Prime Minister was keen to point out that Jess Phillips has been getting threats. He didn't go into any sort of more detail about what that might be, since Elon Musk has been calling her out on Twitter, on X, for her role in this. She's obviously a Home Office minister. Now that I was speaking to the Home Office earlier today, they think there is no need for yet another national inquiry into this scandal. We've, of course, had many of those over the years. The government thinks that to launch yet another one of those is just going to be more time wasted, essentially, down the line, when they say that there are enough recommendations. The last Tory government didn't implement them, and now they have promised they are going to get on and implement all of those recommendations from all of the previous reports and really get on with what they hope will help to safeguard thousands more young people from ever happening again.
One of those recommendations, of course, involves legislation that would force tech firms to take stronger action over online abuse material, an area that Elon Musk should be quite familiar with as the owner of arguably the biggest tech firm in this space.
Yes, I wonder whether that may be a little bit why Elon Musk has been particularly interested in this case. But look, a hugely impassioned Keir Starmer, I thought we saw today, outlining his real argument about why he thinks that he has done everything he can as chief prosecutor. He talked about how he was reopening some of those cases that had been closed in the past, and talking about how he felt that he'd done all he can to try and prosecute some of those gang members. So really, I think Keir Starmer going out all on the front foot for Elon Musk, and made it a lot easier after the weekend, after what Nigel Farage and Elon Musk also got into that spat. I think it makes it a lot easier for him to do so now.
And matters of historical fact, of course, in terms of the decision, overturning of decisions not to prosecute 9 men from Rochdale and Oldham for a total of 77 years, and Nazir Afzal's praise of Keir Starmer for agreeing to change policies and lower the bar for reconsidering prosecutions. For anybody confused, you're on your way back from the speech, Natasha, and currently my Sherlock Holmes skills tell me currently on a railway station platform.
Do you want to guess which one?
Are you coming in from Surrey?
Yes.
So you're at Clapham Junction.
How did you know?
You should know by now, Natasha. Thank you for that. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, but making her way back from that speech by Keir Starmer. Should we listen to the little bit where he specifically addressed these calls for an inquiry, which I think come from people who are probably unaware or possibly pretending to be unaware of the Rochdale report in 2013 that found failures by 17 agencies. Then Andy Burnham called a 3-part inquiry: Greater Manchester in 2020, Oldham in 2022, Rochdale in 2024. You've got Rotherham in 2014, which was led by Alexis Jay, covered the period from 1997 to 2013. Rotherham in 2015, when Louise Casey looked at the council's fitness for purpose and condemned their abdication of responsibility. You've got the Telford inquiry from July of 2022. The Home Affairs Select Committee looked into this in June of 2013. And of course, the 468-page independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which took 7 years to complete and was published in 2022, led by Professor Alexis Jay. I've read every single one of those pages, and I am supremely confident that the louder your voice in calling for another inquiry today, the more certain I am that you haven't read a single page of that one. And my interest in it was personal, because my school features, it gets a little sub-chapter all of its own. But it is the author of that report who has called today for people to stop politicising the issue of sexual violence, because it fails to acknowledge its lifelong impact and hinders the implementation of vital and urgent overhaul to our systems required. This is Keir Starmer addressing a similar point about an hour ago.
This doesn't need more consultation. It doesn't need more research. It just needs action. There have been many, many reviews, this constant asking for a further review. No stone should be left unturned. But frankly, it's time for action. Get on with it. Why didn't the last government implement the J requirement? got to answer that question. For 10 years we've had reviews and reports. Did they act? No. They're now tweeting and talking about what they think should have been done. I've got some pretty basic questions to answer in relation to that, in my view.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 6 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We're diving into elements of that NHS story now, which would, in a normal country, have been the focus of Keir Starmer's interventions today, but for reasons we've spent 2 hours exploring, clearly was not and could not be. I mentioned to you a moment ago, I thought that what I'd seen of Robert Jenrick's contributions to public discourse in the last few days planted him to the right of Nigel Farage, which is an incredibly unpleasant place for anybody to find themselves, and many people might argue an almost political impossibility. I think I also said to the right of Enoch Powell. I'm not going to share with you the full meat. Well, I may do, but I just noticed I hadn't seen that disgusting tweet from Liz Truss. There's a lot I have. I told you thought I was exaggerating at 10 o'clock this morning when I said come off Twitter, and a lot of this stuff just doesn't land. Whether or not that is professionally injurious for me, I shall continue to think on. But do you remember Samuel Kasumu? A former special advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. And Samuel held the Civil Society and Communities brief. He was the most senior black advisor to Boris Johnson, who he resigned, didn't he, in protest at I forget precisely what, something that Johnson was up to. It was so hard to keep up. He was widely referred to as Boris Johnson's sort of racism czar. He has contributed to the conversation about honest Bob Jenrick. And I'll say it again, this is a Conservative advisor, an advisor to the former Conservative Prime Minister, in the same way that Dominic Grieve, who's responded to some of Elon Musk's lies, is a former Conservative Attorney General. At some point, people who care about truth and decency unite in that space where partisanship and party political fealty is no longer relevant. The truth is more important than the colour of the scarf around your neck. So this is Boris Johnson's former race advisor talking about honest Bob Jenrick.
I don't think that Elon Musk or Nigel Farage are the most dangerous individuals in our country. I think Robert Jenrick has the potential to be the most divisive person in our political history. I think some of his words over the last 12 months may result in some people maybe even dying, because he has the potential to incite hatred in ways that I have never seen. Nigel Farage,
saying that about someone in your own
Robert
party.
Jenrick, Nigel Farage, he talks about the things that many people in our country care about, and he articulates himself in a way that sometimes I don't like, but actually he doesn't cross the line. Mm-hmm. Robert Jenrick regularly crosses the line.
And we should say he's not here to defend himself,
and
but it's
probably should come next week and maybe try and justify some of the words that he has been using recently. Completely inappropriate, uncalled for, unjustifiable and wrong. He needs to tone it down, and he needs to do that soon, or else we're going to have a really terrible 2025 in this country.
That's Samuel Kasumu speaking on Sunday with Laura Koonsberg, where Nigel Farage was also permitted, of course, to call for a new national inquiry without being reminded of all the inquiries that had already taken place, or indeed of the views of Professor Alexis Jay, who conducted the last one. And I've lost the tweet, I think. Oh, no, Daz in Norwich, thank you. I hate it when you're cleverer than me. Actually, I love it. It's crowdsourcing. Daz points out that it could have gone worse for Jess Phillips when it started being reported that she had declined, as the Tories did before her, calls for another national inquiry, and insisting that an inquiry into what happened in Oldham would be best conducted in Oldham. Imagine if she had declined that request using language like this.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now? What the people want is to see officers out on the streets doing what they signed up to do.
So let's just run through the list of Tories who may or may not have been in some way adjacent to Boris Johnson over the course of the last 14 years. or maybe just during his premiership, sort of post 2019, now calling for an inquiry, and refresh our memories of what they said when he decided to deploy language like this when describing all investigations into historic child sexual abuse. So Kemi Badenoch has been very outspoken on the subject. Chris Philp has been very outspoken on the subject. Robert Jenrick. Was Philp a policing minister? Jenrick was in the Home Office. If only they'd had jobs where they could have exercised some sort of influence over these sort of issues. If only they could have actually commented upon what their own actual leader said about investigations and inquiries into historic child sexual abuse. Because this is, I'm afraid, one of those moments where I remind you about the state of the nation and indeed the delinquency of our media. I don't know how many Tories, whether they're appearing on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg or LBC, I don't know how many Tories being given space and oxygen to make these ludicrous accusations and claims have been reminded of their own silence when Boris Johnson spoke contemptuously of all investigations into any instances of historic child sexual abuse. I don't know if Philp has been reminded of it. I don't know if Badenoch has. I don't know if Jenrick has. I don't know if any of them have. But I doubt it, don't you? So ask yourself what that says about the British media. The man whose passage into Downing Street was liberally greased by Nigel Farage describes historic child sexual abuse investigations as futile and pointless. But Nigel Farage now is calling for one, despite having been completely silent when Boris Johnson did this.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now? What the people want is to see officers out on the streets doing what they signed up to do.
You put him in Downing Street. You served in his governments. You moaned when he was chased out with his tail between his disgraced legs. You spoke of him in the most glowing of terms, and suddenly Keir Starmer is to blame for an absence of another national inquiry into an issue that you had full power over as a political party for the last 14 years, up to and including Liz Truss actually joining in the attacks upon a safeguarding minister, upon Jess Phillips, already, Keir Starmer revealed today, facing threats. I've been off for a fortnight. Sometimes when I take some time off and I'm not working on a book or writing something else, I find myself thinking, maybe things aren't quite as mad as you thought they were, mate. Maybe you'd get back. I got quite a lot of messages until the last election saying, oh, what are you going to talk about after the next election? You'll be completely... I hope so. It'd be great, wouldn't it, if we could just come on air and talk about social issues every day or talk about family matters. But my goodness me, when I come back to work after a couple of weeks off at 10 o'clock in the morning thinking maybe things aren't quite as mad as they felt before we went away, and you find yourself sitting here contemplating just that, and that just fell into my mind thanks to Daz in Norwich. Had nothing to do with me. I'd completely forgotten about the full extent. I hadn't forgotten about the deployment of the word spaffed. I'd forgotten about the deployment of the word malarkey. But all of these Tories lining up to claim that they care, or to claim that the Labour Party has done something wrong, or to claim that Jess Phillips is somehow delinquent. All of them, absolutely stone cold silent when Boris Johnson used the language of the schoolyard to describe not just a notional future investigation into historical child sexual abuse, but an actual real one, and spoke in hideous terms about the pointlessness and futility of ever investigating these kinds of crimes. I might write a column for the Telegraph about how it's all Keir Starmer's fault.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:17 is the time, and I don't know. I've told you I haven't been paying much attention, but I'm sure that anybody interviewing, for example, Chris Philp, recently would have raised that clip of Boris Johnson maligning all investigations into child sexual abuse, historic child sexual abuse. And I mean, if they didn't, I'm sure they will next time. 12:17 is the time. So I don't like this, because I sometimes quite like zero-sum games. I quite like the notion of publicly owned utilities, for example. And it's easy to support publicly owned utilities by coming up with examples of disasters that have occurred on privately owned utilities. But we're all of an age, aren't we? When I started in this job, people would often ring in to describe how awful British Rail was in the last days of nationalisation. And they were right. As I've got older and read more, I've discovered a fairly strong and compelling narrative that suggests British Rail was deliberately deteriorated, if you can use that as a verb in that sense. It was deliberately deteriorated as a precursor to privatisation. That brings us to Noam Chomsky, doesn't it? Who talks about defund, demoralise, and then soften up something that's state-owned for privatisation. So you persuade a population to sell something that the population technically owns by presiding over a decline in the utility, to the point where a politician, usually from the right, pops up and says, well, we should sell that to the private sector. And you go, well, it can't be any worse than it is now. So, yeah, why not sell all our water companies? Why not sell British Gas? Why not sell the railways? But it's not a zero-sum game, because terrible things happened in nationalised industries, regardless of whether or not there was a narrative of deliberate decline. British Leyland. My dad used to cover British Leyland and the coal, Arthur Scargill's interventions in coal. I don't come to the conversation that we're about to have with very strong ideological views. I'll tell you the truth. The truth is, I've got an emotional commitment to the NHS that makes me slightly uneasy about what Keir Starmer has announced today. I've got an emotional commitment to the notion of a publicly owned NHS, or at least a fully nationalised NHS. But one thing I've discovered doing this job and talking to you over the years is that it hasn't existed forever. It hasn't existed for a very long time. It didn't exist under Tony Blair. The parts of the NHS that has been privatised. It's only after talking to you, that I noticed things like private company insignia on actual ambulances pulling up outside actual hospitals, areas of NHS provision that are done by the private sector. It's everywhere. Trying to get the private sector out of the NHS now. This is my all-time favourite analogy, actually. I usually use it to describe Brexit, but I'm using it to describe the NHS. Are you ready? Trying to get the private sector out of the NHS today would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake. I've got a horrible feeling I didn't come up with that analogy. I used it so much in the aftermath of Brexit that it became attributed to me. People thought it was one of my own. I think I got it off you. I think I may have read it in my inbox, or somebody else may have put it there. But anyway, trying to get the private sector out of the NHS would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake. But does that mean we should have more eggs in our cake? Can you over-egg a pudding? Oh, look at this. This is verbal dexterity that you only get on my first day back from a holiday. Thank you very much. Thank you. So can you over-egg the NHS pudding? You can't get the eggs out of the NHS. But Keir Starmer is keen to put more eggs in. We will have more privatisation, more private provision under the auspices of the NHS. Regardless of who is providing the service, if the government really succeeds in delivering the equivalent of 40,000 extra appointments a week in its first year, then I don't think your mum is going to care that much whether or not the person giving her a new hip is on the payroll of a private company. Well, it wouldn't be the person. Whether the place in which her new hip is installed is owned by a private company or still owned by the nation, as it were. I don't think you would mind, because you're going to hospital as an NHS patient, and you're being treated as an NHS patient, and you're going home as a former NHS patient. But it's still on a... What's the word I want? Yeah, the word I want is emotional. It's still on an emotional level. It still just makes me feel a bit sad. I don't know why. But I do know that this is the central thrust of what Keir Starmer has announced today. So we'll listen again to what he has said about the plan to massively improve waiting lists, to massively improve treatment times, and to ensure that those waiting times are reduced to 18 weeks over the next 5 years. We'll listen again to what he said about the agreement signed with the private sector to make the spaces, the facilities, the resources readily available. And then we will ask healthcare professionals very simply what they think. We do two things very, very well on this programme, and they are both entirely reliant on you. The first is political analysis, and the second is real-life, evidence-based testimony on things that might otherwise get a little bit lost in the ether or a little bit confused. So, some of the people that ring in now to contribute to conversations that we're having get booked as guests on other radio stations and other radio programmes. I can tell, actually, because of what flashes up on my switchboard, if they've been booked as a guest on another LBC programme. But so keen are they to contribute to our conversations that they ring in just like you do. And just like I would do, I think, if I was listening to you on the radio. But that is sometimes dependent upon getting the question right. And the question for people who work in the NHS is whether or not there is anything to worry about in what Keir Starmer has announced today. Is it simply a recognition that getting the private sector out of the NHS, even if you could convince the world that it was a desirable thing to do, would be like getting the eggs out of a baked cake? Or is there a danger that Keir Starmer is now flirting with the over-egging of the NHS pudding?
Our approach must be totally unburdened by dogma. Working people will expect nothing less. So today, I welcome a new agreement that will expand the relationship between the NHS and the private healthcare sector, make the spaces, the facilities and resources of private hospitals more readily available to the NHS. That's more beds, more operations, more care available to the NHS, treating patients free at the point of use, targeted at where we need them most. A partnership in the national interest, cutting waiting times, working for you, delivering our plan for change. Now, I know some people won't like this, but I make no apologies. Change is urgent. I'm not interested in putting ideology before patients.
That was the word I was looking for, actually. Ideology. That's what I'm describing. Ideology is emotional, isn't it, as much as intellectual sometimes. I don't like the idea of private sector in the NHS. I don't like the idea of someone making a profit out of a process that is about your health. You know, that money that they make by doing it in the private sector, by rights, should be going back into the health sector, going back into the national health. But just listen to those opening words again, because that's precisely what I was trying to articulate.
Our approach must be totally unburdened by dogma.
Unburdened by dogma. What a great phrase. Should it be unburdened by dogma? 0345 6060 973. So you work in the NHS. You know more than I do, much more than I do, about just how far the tentacles of privatisation have already extended into the very entrails of the National Health Service. I know that some people listening to this, what I might loosely describe as nice old lefties, are going to balk potentially at the idea of more private sector companies coming into the NHS to make the spaces, the facilities and the resources of their own hospitals readily available. If you work in the private sector, you will know how feasible elements of this are. Do you have a glut of facilities? Do you have a glut of resources? Do you have spare spaces that could be more effectively freed up for NHS patients? As a patient, I don't think you've got much to worry about because you're still going to be an NHS patient. You're not going to have to pay extra to be treated in a facility where previously you would have had to pay extra to be treated. And unburdened by dogma sounds to me like quite a good thing to be. And yet, of course, it's dependent entirely on how good that dogma is. So, one of the most illuminating phone-ins we've had in a long time when it comes to the NHS was about people who were going private against their better instincts. People who really did believe passionately in the importance of a publicly funded national health service that was free at the point of care, but who contemplated waiting lists. I always remember the grandmother telling me about her grandson's tonsils and the agony he was in and the impact it was having on all sorts of areas of her life. And you could tell it wasn't just with a heavy heart. She was absolutely distraught. And she could barely afford it anyway. But she was distraught that she was contributing to the private health sector when the importance of the NHS was burned into her heart. But her grandson's pain, her grandson's condition, overcame her concerns, overcame her, well, up to a point, because she was still pretty gutted about the whole thing. I don't want to have that conversation today. I want to have a grown-up, adult discussion about Keir Starmer abandoning dogma and embracing the private sector in the context of reducing waiting lists and waiting times. And I want you to tell me what that means. And of course, more importantly, what you think about it, particularly in the space of healthcare professionals, particularly if this is what you do. Do you welcome this? Does it sound like good news? The feasibility is something that only time will tell. But in terms of the desirability, have a guess. How many treatments do you think were still waiting to be carried out at the end of October last year? Have a guess. I'll tell you after the headlines with Amelia Cox, and then you can tell me how you feel either as an old lefty or as a doctor or a nurse or as a political neutral or as a rabid right-winger. How do you feel about Keir Starmer embracing the private sector and abandoning what you would describe, I think, as socialist dogma? Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
34 is the time. I think I've got... what do we call? I've forgotten what we call it. What do we call that thing where I explain what a story's really about, or I misinformation? The one where it took so long to get a jingle, I forgot what we'd call it. I've got an excellent misinformation for you later today. But we must crack on with the NHS conversation. John is in Ipswich to look at the unburdening of ideology, for good or for ill. John, what do you reckon?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Well, firstly, I would say myself a moderate Tory, but I'll admit that the Labour Party have always done better with the NHS.
Yes, that's true.
But sometimes private can be actually cheaper than public.
How? I don't doubt you. This is coming from a position of curiosity, not pugnaciousness, John.
Okay. So in the ambulance service,
yes,
we often use private providers. And the reason why is because we can use them to fill areas, times of, or periods where demand is in excess, like, for instance, in the summer and particularly winter pressures. And it's more cost-effective to hire in a crew for 3 or 4 months of the year than keep them for 12 months of the year.
Yes. And that, in the specific crucible of your job and experience, is a positive. But what do the personnel do? And this is, again, coming from a place of curiosity more than anything else. What do the personnel do when they're not busy?
What do they do? Actually, I'll be honest with you, I don't know.
So that's what worries me, because you make it sound like a 0 hours contract.
No, most of the ones that I know of are salaried. My job is to assess their competence and.
So why would
we have very strict criteria to make sure they're competent
yes.
and can fulfil the role.
So what? So it's cheaper because you're not paying them when you're not using them.
That's right.
But the private sector company is paying them when you're not using them.
Yes, so they have to factor in that as a business case for themselves, don't they?
Yeah, but which probably means you are paying them when you're not paying them because they're being paid from the money that they make from providing you with personnel, but they're doing it all so much more efficiently than the NHS could that you still come out on top.
I'm not sure I fully agree with that, James.
Well, then you can disagree with it, but you have to tell me what they're doing when they're not working for you. Working for other NHS trusts?
About how to get out of this mess.
Yeah, no, the phone line's gone. The phone line's gone funny, John. Unfortunately, and as I say, I'm coming from a position of curiosity because I like the phrase "unburdened by dogma," but I appreciate that a lot of people don't, and I also appreciate that you might be right and I might be wrong. Drew puts it very well in Bonhill. Starmer's use of the word dogma is a deliberate deployment of what is now generally accepted as a pejorative term. It's wholly inappropriate to reference a principled belief that many hold in this way, and it won't further the debate or win any friends, says Drew in Bonhill in Scotland. I refer the honourable member to the eggs. The private sector can do a job for the NHS in the world we currently inhabit, Drew. And it might not be the world you want to inhabit. And you could certainly make a case for saying the likelihood of ever getting back to the world I want to inhabit is reduced according to the deployment or the abandonment of this dogma. But if the top priority is reducing waiting lists, is this the best way forward? 12:38 is the time. Gwen is in Stevenage. Gwen, what would you like to say?
Oh, morning.
Hello,
you can hear me okay? Hello,
Loud and clear.
Good. So I am an ideological NHS employee who, over my 30-plus years, has learned to be a bit more pragmatic. So I was very anti.
Word. Pragmatic, isn't it? Is pragmatic the opposite of dogma?
Is it?
Pragmatic or dogmatic? I think it is, I think you've blooming done it, Gwen. Anyway, carry on.
Okay. So when I was a young thing, I was very anti-private healthcare and got offered a job for lots of money in a private hospital and turned it down because I didn't agree with the whole ethos, blah, blah, blah. Years and years later now, I've seen what happens to patients when they wait 4, 5, 6 years for a joint replacement, where their lives are completely ruined by the pain that they go through and the inability to live their lives as they should be doing.
Yes.
And we can't do it without private healthcare until such a time that we have the right workforce in place. And I hope, I completely agree with what Starmer was saying, but I do have a caveat to that in that I would like him to then announce that he's going to improve the workforce numbers because we're still desperately short-staffed.
How does he do that?
Training. Increasing training places for doctors.
That's a thing, isn't it, that doesn't get talked about much. I know people who got straight A's in A-level who can't get into medical school.
Absolutely, so do I. Yeah,
it's crazy, right?
Absolutely. So that needs to change. That needs to be addressed. And, I went through all of this when I was young too. The whole workforce planning thing happened. I think it was called Project 2000 or something. I can't remember. Where they looked at future-proofing, staffing figures, all the rest of it. And we've just gone through a series of attacks on the system that has just led us to where we are now, which is we don't have enough staff. We don't have enough capacity.
7.54 million treatments still waiting to be carried out at the end of October last year. So if your priority is to reduce that number, you have no choice in the short term but to use spaces, facilities and resources that already exist, albeit that they are owned by private hospitals.
Absolutely. You've got to think about the human side of this. You tell someone who needs to have surgery done, has suffered quite dramatically, being told, well, actually, we're not going to use private sector anymore. You're going to have to wait another 2 years.
Yeah.
It's life-changing.
And that's what would happen. So if we tried to take the eggs out of the baked cake, you'd be telling someone who's been waiting for 3 years for a new hip that it's actually going to be another 3.
Yeah. I mean, ideology doesn't help. It doesn't help in healthcare. It doesn't. And I go from a position of having been a raving little socialist,
yes,
right on girl.
Don't make that sound like a bad thing, please.
And I'm still a Labour voter,
but it's dogma versus pragma. If pragma is a word, it's dogmatism versus pragmatism. It is. So, and the caveat is, we wouldn't want this to be the permanent state of affairs. We would like to solve the current crisis while simultaneously putting the system in place to ensure that the NHS will in future provide the provision that is needed without recourse to private hospitals.
Absolutely.
That's when the nimbleness...
It's already happening now.
Yes, go on.
We're already using private hospitals to do joint replacements where I work. We're already... So I don't know why everyone's getting their knickers in a twist about it. And you do need
They're not. No one's getting their knickers in a twist about it. He's only announced it today. Well, I guess a couple of my texters across that it isn't, a little bit more... dogmatic or ideological, but in the context of getting these numbers down, this is the only thing they can do, I think.
I having been involved for...
It still might not work.
It might not, but what do we do? Do we, live as ideologues and allow people to suffer? I see patients every day. I can't condone that. It would be a disaster, so...
I hear you. No, and that's what I thought. And I like the fact that you brought your political affiliations to the table as well, because I think they are really important. You, to the point where we recognise the importance of not letting them cloud our judgment on the pragmatic question. But this is, one caller does not an entire topic make. Richard points out, if a private company holds all the assets, it means that they aren't overheads. So you think of gully suckers. I'm not going to explain that, but it's a mark of someone who's been paying attention to the programme for a long time. But the price is still paid for those services. It's like renting rather than getting a mortgage. So rather than owning the asset in the public domain, it's in the hands of a private sector that takes a profit from the hiring of that service. But that doesn't undermine Gwen's point, Richard, I don't think, as long as we recreate an NHS where it is owned in the future, so that 10 years from now, you don't need to use the private hospitals, which means the private sector bear the burden of their facilities no longer being as popular or no longer being as profitable. They may not be profitable at all. Hopefully they will be, because you wouldn't want anything to go bust necessarily for a whole heap of reasons, not least the people that work there. But that's where, renting can be the right solution in some cases. Nobody buys, for example, a generator when they're having a party for one weekend of the year. You rent a generator because you only need it for one weekend. And if this period of waiting list reduction can be limited, then at the end of it, you wouldn't, well, does that quite work? You'd have bought your own generator because you're going to be having a party every weekend. And that's the point at which my analogy completely falls to pieces. Not in a bad way, not because I'm wrong, but just because it's the wrong analogy at the right time for the right story. It's 1:45. James Acaster. No way. I love that man. I love him with an unholy passion. Is he really the one who was responsible for saying that it's like trying to take the eggs out of a baked cake, as two texters have now told me? I can't be. He's very near the top of my wish list, for full disclosure, James Acaster. I think he's one of the funniest men ever to draw breath. But if I've nicked it off him, then I shall have to apologise, because another texter reminds me of that wonderful quote. I've lost it now. I can't remember who said it to Oscar Wilde. So somebody said something clever, and Oscar Wilde said, I wish I'd said that. And the person clever who'd said it said, you will, Oscar, you will. I often feel like that about some of my texts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:48 is the time. A quick missing word round. I can tell I've been away for a couple of weeks. I could do another couple of hours. Don't tell Sheila. Ready? Enemies could use blank for attack. Enemies could use blank for attack. This is a question of national security, something unexpected in my view that could be deployed by our enemies to facilitate attacks upon our sovereign soil. Speaking of sovereignty, how can all these reform people be fond of Elon Musk interfering in British politics and using his money to influence it? I don't know. Something perhaps you could ask Nigel Farage when he appears on this radio station yet again tomorrow. So that is your missing word round. And now it is time for another regular feature that I generally forget about until I remember it, and then it becomes regular again.
Missed information.
Thank you, Emily. So you know that bit where I played you the clip of Boris Johnson essentially maligning and denigrating every investigation into historic child sex abuse ever, and pointed out that all of the journalists giving Tories a free rein to attack the Labour Party for things that are largely unspecified but something to do with inquiries and investigations, never mentioned the fact that they were all in the cabinet or cheerleading for the man who poo-pooed and used quite ripe language to describe all of it. And you get these little clips from the past, and they're wonderful methods with which to essentially denude hypocrisy and denude hypocrites. Here's a wonderful one. So there's a headline in the Daily Mail today: fury over PM's plot to rig the polls by axing voter ID rules. So you'll remember that the last government introduced requirements for people to produce ID, photo ID, when they turn up to vote, despite there being next to no evidence of there being any voter fraud in that sort of field ever. And one of the politicians, well, he's not a politician, one of the unemployed civilians, I'm sure he's not unemployed, one of the weirdos that they've sort of queued up to complain about this is Jacob Rees-Mogg. You remember Jacob Rees-Mogg? So let's just run through this again. Fury over PM's plot to rig the polls by axing voter ID rules. This must be a different Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. And we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well, was one of the glories of our country, actually.
So apparently fury over PM's plot to reintroduce a system that worked perfectly well and was, frankly, a glory of our country. That is the end of this week's, or at least today's,
Missed information.
And the missing word, thank you, Emily. And the missing word is wind farms. Enemies could use wind farms for attack. Wind turbine blades made with stealth materials and masts that spot incoming missiles are among the technologies being considered to mitigate growing concern that offshore wind farms could hide enemy attacks from radar. Wow. Catherine's in Hampstead to steer us back to dogmatism, if that's a word, versus pragmatism, which definitely is. What would you like to say, Catherine?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Well, just to say, I have completely changed my opinion. I worked in the NHS for 34 years. I was 100% NHS. All that time I felt that the private sector should really be unnecessary in this country if all of our colleagues worked 100% for the NHS, because most NHS consultants do 1 day a week or something in the private sector. So I did feel very strongly that if we all just worked for the NHS totally, there wouldn't be a need for the private sector. However, since I've retired, and probably in the last 5-7 years of working, I've realised there's an absolute need for using the private sector, and I completely agree with what Keir Starmer has said. As your previous caller said, we're already using it for joint replacements, but we really need it. From the point of view of the public, they're going to be getting the same service as they would have been getting. The only issue is where the service is being provided and how much it is costing the taxpayer. But in terms of the public, it means they will be seen sooner, and they will be treated probably by NHS doctors, possibly in an NHS facility, but maybe not. But, it's just common sense.
What changed for you? I mean, because here's the thing, Catherine. It doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means that ship has sailed. So the idea of reversing back to a place where there was practically no private health provision in this country at all has become impossible because of the difficulty of extracting eggs from a baked cake. Therefore, you've become pro-egg.
Yes.
Is that it?
Well, yes, it is, because you have to live in the moment. You have to respond to reality.
The world that we live in. This is the world that we live in, not necessarily the world that we would construct if we could start again from scratch, but this is the world we inhabit.
But there are so many factors, James, to this. Yes. Your previous caller talked about training, which is an absolute must. Another factor from the point of view of the NHS is retention of staff. So, I've spoken to you before about this. Our doctors, nurses, physios, our physios, radiographers, all those people. But from the other side of it, the public health is in such a state. We have so much obesity, which affects all of the factors, other causes other diseases and worsens other diseases. But also we have loads of people who had childhood diseases that in the past would have meant they died in childhood, who are now getting treatment and living to adulthood and having children. So these people are all, it's brilliant, but it means that we have a demand on healthcare which is, it's completely different. Yes. It's not unsustainable because we have to evolve, and science and
unsustainable without doing the new things that they're talking about doing. And how worried are you about this becoming, the new normal, to coin that horrible phrase, whereby we're giving more money than we should to the private sector for the sort of forever, rather than using this as a treatment of a malaise, after which the whole body politic will be in better shape?
I think it doesn't worry me in the way it would have in the past. And the reason for that is I think we have to face reality and say, look, we use the facilities we've got. We pay for what we need. And this is going to be, as you said earlier, probably about 10 years that this might need to occur for. But if we get to the stage where during that time we can make changes within the NHS whereby we train our doctors, nurses, radiographers, physios, laboratory workers, all of that, and we do something to start retaining them, within 10 years, it may be the case that actually the NHS develops the capacity to deal with what the public requires in terms of health service provision. Yes.
Before you go, why are there students with straight A's who can't get places in medical school? Do you know?
There aren't enough places. It takes time. These students require quite intensive teaching, and small group teaching and individual teaching throughout the thing. So it's the same doctors who are providing the services in the NHS who are, I've taught thousands of medical students over my years. So we're doing all of those things. There's a certain capacity for the number of people that you can teach effectively and safely. And that, so that's a major part of it. Yeah.
Catherine, thank you. That's very helpful. Remind me what you did in the NHS, if you don't mind. You don't have to.
I was a consultant anaesthetist, so I was in theatre. Yeah.
Yes, so you know exactly what you're talking about, which makes one of us. Catherine, thank you very much. The time is approaching 12:57. I like that phrase, pro-egg. I'm very pro-egg. But dogma, unburdened by dogma. It's such an interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? Because you can make it sound like the end of civilization as we know it. You don't stand for anything. What's that line from Hamilton? You don't stand for... I can't remember. God, this is good stuff, isn't it, She? Honestly.
That is classic first day back.
You're taking notes, are you?
Listen, I've got no place to do so.
Or you make it sound like the most obvious thing under the sun. Of course we shouldn't be burdened by dogma when it's actually going to hinder treatment. Last word, anyway, brief it will have to be, because I've been wobbling on all morning, to Louise in Billericay. What's it going to be, Louise?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank goodness you're back.
I couldn't agree more.
I think it's perfect to finish here because this is not new.
No.
Your last two callers have been spot on. The NHS is in such a mess, you've got to work out what levers to pull. And the first lever to pull is to try and clear the backlog. When Tony Blair came in, they weren't perfect, but we got to an 18-week waiting time.
Yes.
I was working with the NHS at the time, and we had mobile units in car parks in hospitals throughout the country doing hips and knees and cataracts and things you referred to earlier. The NHS has a limited amount of theatres, and there are certain procedures that can only be done in the NHS because of the level of aftercare needed.
Exactly.
So
just do the stuff. Even if some people can describe it as nibbling at the edges or cherry picking or taking all the more profitable work, just get the numbers down.
Yeah. But what I want to finish by pulling it all together, James, is this isn't bold, it's necessary. What would be bold would be to say we're going to do some really big things to make sure we can come back from this, which you've been alluding to.
That's the acid test.
Let's take 3 universities in this country, James. The NHS is the biggest employer in Europe, and let's make them universities just to train NHS.
What a great idea. I'm out of time. I warned you that I would be, and you've completely ridden roughshod over all of my times and regulations. And thank you to Stephen for reminding me of that quote. If you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for? You see? Did you get it? Yeah? That's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Oh, I've got some exciting news for you in the podcast sphere that I may share with you tomorrow. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. I almost lost the ability to speak then. I just
it happens.
It does it? Yeah, yeah. It's not just me?
No, not at all.
Okay, here's Sheila Fogarty.
It's okay. And by the way, I'll never judge you because, remember, I am the woman who once said, "Good afternoon, welcome to Superdrug." Oh, yeah. At the opening moment of my programme. There was something of an explanation for it, but not much, to be honest with you.
No. James O'Brien on LBC.